Well, at 4:26 p.m. today, Maggie Haberman posted this to the New York Times live update of the Trump trial, reporting from inside the courtroom. Trump left the courtroom squinting strangely at Lawrence O'Donnell, the MSNBC host, as he did. Adam Klasfeld, who has been in the courtroom for us every day, reported that same moment this way. As he exits, Trump turns his head directly at Lawrence, glowers, and mutters under his breath, "I was sitting right next to him," meaning right next to me. It was my first time in the Trump trial courtroom, and it seems Donald Trump wasn't really pleased to see me. That's a shot of me. It looks like I'm very far behind Donald Trump, but I'm actually in the first row that's available to the press. And visually, there was just nothing between Donald Trump and me when I was sitting in that row. And later in the afternoon, I was sitting in an even better spot in that row. And I have my interpretation of what Donald Trump's face and eyes were trying to say to me and what drove him to create a final moment in the courtroom today that was worthy of New York Times reporting. Donald Trump's political advisor and handyman, Boris Epshteyn, was there sitting in the front row reserved for the Trump family members who did not show up once again. Boris Epshteyn was sitting right in front of me and knew I was there. He should have told Donald Trump, when you walk by O'Donnell, don't give him the satisfaction of making a moment about him. But defendants like Donald Trump always make mistakes in courtrooms. And mistakes are what has landed Donald Trump in criminal courtrooms. Manhattan's criminal courtroom 1530 is a room of broken lives. Like all criminal courtrooms, it has seen an endless parade of the broken lives lived by the people who have made the worst mistake in their lives that leaves them sitting in the defendant's chair in that courtroom. Other than the falsely accused, very bad mistakes, often a series of bad mistakes, lead to criminal courtrooms. Donald Trump was not the only broken life in that room on display today. The broken man sitting beside him at the defense table rose once again to defend the indefensible. Everyone in New York legal circles, including people I respect the most, have at one point or another told me that Todd Blanche is an excellent lawyer. Some of the people who told me that months ago have switched to the past tense. Was an excellent lawyer. Before he sold his professional soul to Donald Trump, Todd Blanche was a much respected, highly paid partner in a prestigious Manhattan law firm after serving as a federal prosecutor and acquiring valuable trial skills. He could have stayed in that partnership, in that law firm, for the rest of his professional life. He could have been well regarded for the rest of his professional life. Instead, to take on Donald Trump as a client, he had to quit his law firm because the law firm wanted no association with Donald Trump. And having quit his law firm, he moved with his family to Florida to become a full-time Trump defense lawyer, working for exactly one client. There is no good story in the history of jurisprudence about a criminal defense lawyer who decides to work for only one client. A client who has enough criminal legal business to keep that lawyer employed for years and years and years. Even mafia lawyers have had many other clients not in organized crime. In criminal courtroom 1530, Todd Blanche last week suffered the ultimate professional humiliation when Judge Juan Merchan said to him, "You are losing all credibility with the court." And as I said at the time, you can spend a lifetime in courtrooms and never hear a judge say that to a good lawyer. Never. Today's court session began with what was scheduled as a half-hour hearing about Donald Trump's latest violations of the judge's gag order. The prosecution presented those 4 new violations in a 10-minute, tight, logical, seemingly irrefutable presentation. The worst of the violations was Donald Trump's comment last week about the jury. Prosecutor Christopher Conroy read it to the judge as the first item he raised. Quote, this is what Donald Trump said. That jury was picked so fast, 95% Democrats. The area is mostly all Democrat. You think of it as just a purely Democrat area. It is a very unfair situation. That I can tell you. The prosecutor then went on to cite other violations of the gag order, which forbids Donald Trump from making any public comments about witnesses. Prosecutors cited Donald Trump's recent comments about Michael Cohen and David Pecker. At 9:42 a.m., when Todd Blanche stood up to defend Donald Trump's apparent violations of the gag order, he rambled on without making a single legal point for 20 minutes and never said a word about the most serious violation, Donald Trump's attack on the jury. When Todd Blanche was trying to defend Donald Trump's comments about witnesses, he said, quote, he can't just say no comment repeatedly when he's running for president. That is, of course, a lie. That is a lawyer telling a lie in a courtroom. It is not just a point of argument. Candidates refuse to comment on issues all the time. No one does it more than Donald Trump. Donald Trump very specifically refused to declare his position on abortion for months and months during the Republican presidential primaries. No politician in our history has refused to answer more questions than Donald Trump, while his mouth is still moving, saying other things in response to the question, usually nonsense and lies, having nothing to do with the question. And just to sink Todd Blanche even deeper into the darkness of his broken professional life, Donald Trump himself proved Todd Blanche was lying at the end of the day. After Donald Trump walked angrily past me into the hallway of the courtroom where he spoke to a pool of reporters there with the cameras rolling, the last question asked of him was, what did he think of the witness who took up most of the trial day today, Keith Davidson? And Donald Trump said, well, I'm not allowed to testify. I'm under a gag order, I guess. I can't testify. Now we're going to be appealing the gag order. I'd love to answer that question. It's a very easy question, the easiest question so far, but I'm not allowed to testify because this is a judge who's totally conflicted. He has me under an unconstitutional gag order. Those were Donald Trump's words. Now, of course, Donald Trump is not a master of the English language. He didn't actually mean testify. He simply meant, I can't answer your question because I am under a gag order. Todd Blanche may have learned nothing in the courtroom today, but Donald Trump did. He learned from that hearing how to respond to a question about witnesses in this case, which is to not answer it at all, and if he wants to, cite his gag order, which is exactly what Donald Trump did at the end of the day. Donald Trump's response in the hallway today directly contradicted Todd Blanche, directly destroyed Todd Blanche's credibility, and the principal argument in defense of Donald Trump's violations of the gag order. So a week after the judge tells Todd Blanche he's lost credibility with the judge, how could it get worse for Todd Blanche? Donald Trump found a way to make it worse today. Donald Trump went out in the hallway at the end of the day and, in effect, ridiculed Todd Blanche's defense of Donald Trump's violations of the gag order. Apparently, Todd Blanche had no intention of even addressing the worst violation of the gag order presented by the prosecutors, which was Donald Trump's comments and attacks against the jury, who he accuses of being 95% Democrat without having any idea how many of those jurors might be Democrats, how many might be Republicans. 12% of Manhattan voted for Donald Trump. Judge Merchan is not an impatient judge. There are some who could accuse him of being too patient. Like this morning, he let Todd Blanche say nothing for over 20 minutes today before the judge finally had to interrupt him and say, can I ask you to address the comments that were made about the jury? Todd Blanche began with the stupidest possible response about the actual words Donald Trump said. Donald Trump told the judge, it was a 15-second statement out of an interview that was over 21 minutes long. It doesn't matter if the interview were 5 days long. What matters is what Donald Trump said. Did he violate the order? The judge repeatedly had to ask Todd Blanche, did he violate the gag order? And Todd Blanche actually said, quote, the gag order specifically references any prospective juror or any juror in this criminal proceeding. So he wasn't referencing juror number 4 is a Democrat, whereupon you could see the judge give up on Todd Blanche. He shook his head, the judge shook his head, smiled in a strained way just a bit. I silently laughed at the preposterous thing that Todd Blanche just said. It was the most preposterous possible answer Todd Blanche could have given. He wasn't talking about juror number 4. You can't find that reaction in the script, the reaction of the room. You can't find the judge's physical reaction to what he heard Todd Blanche say. The transcript is just words, and there is so much that happens in that room beyond the words. In presenting this violation about the jury, the prosecutor said he used his platform there to criticize the seated jury in this case. There is no inference needed. It is not just any jurors. It is these jurors in this case sitting right in this room in a few minutes. And Todd Blanche's disgraceful and guaranteed to lose defense of that violation of the gag order is to actually say, Donald Trump didn't specify any one of the jurors. No, he didn't. He specified every one of the jurors, every one of them who filed into that room at the end of that hearing and passed by Donald Trump as fast as they could without looking at him in any way, as if there were an obstacle there that they had to speed past, something dangerous. I have never seen a faster walking jury in my life, a jury who wants to get past by that defendant and get that move past the defendant over and done with as fast as their legs can carry them. It's not unusual for some jurors to take in the room when they enter in other cases. Their eyes sometimes fall on the prosecutor, often on the judge, sometimes on the defendant, frequently smile at the judge. Sometimes there can be small smiles that are flashed around the room by jurors that don't really tell you anything about what they're thinking, but often just show you that a group of people are entering this room with hints of their humanity on display. Not so with the Trump jury when they enter. When they take their places in the jury box, which I had a very full view of in the afternoon, they settle into their roles and all pay very strict attention at all times to what is happening in that room. And it doesn't seem that any of them have likely complained about freezing in the courtroom as Donald Trump has done relentlessly, including one of the middle-aged jurors who was wearing nothing but a T-shirt all day. That's how freezing it wasn't in the courtroom. But as a defendant in the courtroom, every moment must be chilling. Certainly it is for Donald Trump. Donald Trump spent most of his courtroom day listening to someone he has never met. The third broken life on display in the courtroom today, Keith Davidson, a lawyer who even Todd Blanche can look down on. Keith Davidson's testimony revealed that he makes much or most of his living as a bottom feeder in a cesspool that no law school student has ever aspired to. It was attorney Keith Davidson who negotiated a $130,000 hush money payment to porn star Stormy Daniels to guarantee her silence about her one, according to her, very quick sexual encounter with Donald Trump. Keith Davidson's testimony that he negotiated the $130,000 deal with Michael Cohen is documented in email records, text messages, and voice recording records. There is absolutely no reasonable doubt left in the room that Keith Davidson negotiating that deal on behalf of Stormy Daniels with Michael Cohen. That is the essence of his testimony. That's what it's about. That's why he's a witness. But when your life goes so far off course that you find yourself negotiating hush money payments for porn stars with presidential candidates so that you can help hide the truth about that candidate from voters for a fee of $10,000 that you earn from that transaction. It might not be the only unseemly thing you've been involved with in your life. And so, on cross-examination, much to Donald Trump's delight, I'm sure, but to no relevant point, Donald Trump's other criminal defense lawyer, Emile Beauvais, tried to expose Keith Davidson's role in trying to arrange hush money payments and successfully arranging hush money payments, in one case allegedly for as much as $2 million, from other famous men, including Hulk Hogan and Charlie Sheen. Keith Davidson was also involved in trafficking information about the treatment of young actress Lindsay Lohan in a rehab facility. This testimony from this person who has sullied his law degree took place in a building filled with honorable lawyers working for government salaries or for public defender wages who every day make the law a noble calling. But every courthouse has the other kind of lawyers, the worst kind of lawyers, passing through those courthouses every day too. And with every bit of dirt that Keith Davidson revealed about himself and every bit of dirt that was thrown at him by Donald Trump's lawyer, what really mattered in that room is that the oldest person in the room, sitting under a crown of blonde hair at the defense table, lived his life in such a way that his future was in the hands of Keith Davidson in October of 2016. When he was asking the people of the United States of America to make him the next president. I was sitting in the front row of the reporters section of the courtroom, which is actually the third row of spectator seats. The first row is reserved for 2 Secret Service agents. The second row is reserved for the non-existent Trump family. And then there's the third row, where in the afternoon there was nothing. Nothing between me and the back of Donald Trump's head. That very same seat was occupied last week by the brilliant writer Jonathan Alter, who wrote at some length for the Washington Monthly about his day of contemplation staring at, quote, the back of his head, the meticulously coiffed souffle. What you see under the hair in that courtroom is a very, very small man. Donald Trump is actually the tallest person in the courtroom, at least an inch taller than I am, but when he sits in his chair, he does it with the common slump of the elderly. He sinks. His 77-year-old backbone shrinks to the point where he is sitting as the shortest man at the defense table. And he sits for the first time in his life as a little man in confinement. There are many people in America hoping Donald Trump goes to jail. There may be just as many or almost as many hoping that he doesn't. But for those who hope Donald Trump goes to jail, you can put aside some of that hope now, because courtroom 1530 from 9 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. is Donald Trump's jail. It is the first time in his life he is not allowed to leave the room whenever he wants to. It is the first time in his life when he doesn't get to decide when to enter. It is the first time in his life that he does not get to decide what to say. He is not allowed to speak. He is not allowed to move. He's not allowed to leave. Walt Nauta is not walking in every 10 minutes with a fresh Diet Coke. There's no Diet Coke in the room. Donald Trump hasn't experienced anything close to that since high school. And in high school, it was never for more than 45 minutes or an hour at a time. Donald Trump's jail is upon him now. He might face more jail time, some form of real jail time. But for now, these are the very worst days of the broken life of Donald Trump.